There is a form of manipulation that almost no man ever notices while it's happening. Not because he's weak, not because he's unintelligent, but because it doesn't look like manipulation. There are no demands, no threats, no obvious control. In fact, it often looks like affection, confusion, emotion, or even vulnerability. And by the time a man realizes something feels wrong, he's already emotionally invested. This is dark psychology, not in the sense of evil intent, but in the sense of unconscious influence. Here's the uncomfortable truth most men never hear. Most women don't manipulate men deliberately. They manipulate emotionally, instinctively, subconsciously, without sitting down and planning anything. And that's exactly why it works. Because manipulation that is unconscious is far more powerful than manipulation that is intentional. It doesn't feel like control. It feels like connection. Let's start with something crucial. Manipulation does not begin with behavior. It begins with emotional leverage. If a man needs something emotionally from a woman, she has leverage. Attention, reassurance, validation, certainty, approval. The moment you emotionally need one of these, you are no longer interacting as equals. You are negotiating from below. Most men never notice this shift. They think they're just interested, just invested, just caring. But emotionally, they've handed over control. Now here's where it gets dangerous. Women are extremely sensitive to emotional leverage, not because they are malicious, but because they are socially and emotionally intuitive. They feel when a man is leaning emotionally, and once they feel it, their behavior changes. Not consciously, but instinctively. They pull back slightly. They delay responses. They shift tone. They become less available. This is not always intentional. It's often a nervous system response. And here's the key point. That pullback creates anxiety in the man, and anxiety is the gateway to manipulation. Once a man feels anxious about losing connection, he starts adjusting. He explains himself more, he becomes more agreeable, he lowers boundaries, he seeks reassurance. And now the loop is complete. She reacts, he adjusts. This is the core dynamic behind most emotional manipulation. Not dominance, not cruelty, but reaction and adjustment. The person who adjusts is the one being led. Another truth most men don't want to accept is this. Manipulation rarely looks like control. It looks like emotional inconsistency. Warm one moment, cold the next, close then distant, interested then unsure. This inconsistency creates confusion. Confusion creates emotional focus, and emotional focus creates attachment. Most men mistake this attachment for attraction. It's not. It's anxiety-based bonding, and anxiety-based bonding is easy to control. Another subtle manipulation most men never see is guilt framing. Statements like, "I guess I just care more than you do," or "I wouldn't do that to you," or "I thought you were different." These statements don't attack. They imply, and implication is powerful because it forces the man to self-correct. He feels the need to prove himself, to explain, to reassure, to compensate. And compensation is submission. Another layer of this dark psychology is emotional outsourcing. Many women unconsciously use men as emotional regulators. They vent, they unload, they release emotion. The man listens, absorbs, holds space. At first, this feels like intimacy, but over time, it creates imbalance. The man becomes emotionally responsible, and responsibility kills polarity. Once polarity is gone, attraction fades, but control remains, because the man is now emotionally invested in maintaining balance. Another uncomfortable truth is this: manipulation does not require intent. It only requires unawareness on the man's side. A woman doesn't need to plan anything. She simply responds to emotional leverage, and the man, trying to keep connection, does the rest. This is why so many men say things like, "I don't know how it happened," or "I changed without realizing it," or "I lost myself in the relationship." They didn't lose themselves suddenly. They adjusted slowly, one reaction at a time. Another powerful manipulation dynamic is silence. Silence is not absent. Silence is pressure. When a woman goes quiet without explanation, the man's mind fills the gap. Did I do something wrong? Is she losing interest? Should I fix this? And the moment he reaches out to relieve that discomfort, the silence has done its job. It created movement toward her. Another form of manipulation is conditional affection. Warmth when you comply, distance when you don't. Most men don't recognize this pattern until they're deeply inside it, because the affection feels real. And often, it is real. That's what makes it effective. The danger is not affection. The danger is patterned withdrawal, because it trains behavior. And once behavior is trained, control becomes automatic. Another truth men resist is this: manipulation only works on men who fear loss more than they value self-respect. Fear is the entry point. Fear of losing her, fear of conflict, fear of being alone. That fear makes men bend, and bending becomes habit. This is why manipulation increases over time, not because women escalate, but because men surrender more ground, little by little. Most men never notice the moment it starts because the beginning feels harmless. It feels like caring, like compromise, like effort. But effort driven by fear is not love, it's leverage. And once leverage exists, manipulation does not need force. It operates silently, through emotion, through reaction, through imbalance. This is the reality most men never confront, not because it's rare, but because it's subtle. And anything subtle is hardest to see when you're inside it. This is the foundation you need to understand, because until you see how manipulation actually works, you will keep fighting the wrong enemy. You'll blame women, you'll blame yourself, you'll blame bad luck, when the real issue was emotional leverage all along. And once you see it, you can never unsee it, because every dynamic suddenly makes sense. This is where awareness begins, and awareness is the first thing manipulation cannot survive. Once this dynamic is in place, manipulation doesn't need effort anymore. It runs on momentum, because the man has already internalized a dangerous belief that keeping the connection alive is his responsibility, and responsibility is where power shifts. Most men think manipulation looks like control over actions. It doesn't. It looks like control over emotional direction. Who feels anxious? Who feels calm? Who waits? Who reacts? The person who reacts loses position. Another dark mechanism almost no one talks about is emotional unpredictability disguised as authenticity. A woman may say she's just being honest or just emotional, and often she is. But emotional expression without accountability still creates imbalance. When her emotions dictate the pace, tone, and stability of the connection, the man starts orienting himself around her internal state. He checks her mood. He adapts his behavior. He braces emotionally. This is not partnership. This is emotional leadership handed over unconsciously. Another manipulation pattern is the reversal of roles. At first, she is warm, engaged, open. Then, slowly, she becomes less available. The man notices the shift and tries to restore the original dynamic. He invests more, communicates more, explains more, and suddenly he is doing emotional labor to maintain what once flowed naturally. That reversal is not accidental. It is leverage forming. Another subtle tactic is emotional ambiguity. Statements that are unclear, feelings that are half expressed, intentions that are hinted at but never stated. Ambiguity creates mental loops. Mental loops create obsession. Obsession creates compliance. The man keeps thinking, replaying conversations, trying to interpret meaning. And the more cognitive energy he spends, the more invested he becomes. Investment without clarity is manipulation's fuel. Another dark aspect is the use of comparison. Not direct comparison, implied comparison. Mentions of other men, past relationships, external validation. Not to provoke jealousy consciously, but to subtly communicate replaceability. Replaceability creates insecurity. Insecurity creates compliance. Once a man feels replaceable, he lowers standards to avoid loss. Another manipulation pathway is emotional exhaustion. Long emotional conversations, repeated conflict without resolution, cycles of closeness and withdrawal. Over time, the man becomes tired. Tired people don't enforce boundaries. They choose peace over integrity. And peace at the cost of integrity is surrender. Another truth men rarely admit is this: manipulation often feels like love at first, because intense emotional engagement feels meaningful. But intensity without stability creates dependency, and dependency is control's foundation. Another subtle mechanism is moral framing, making the man feel like setting boundaries is selfish, that prioritizing himself is cold, that questioning the dynamic is unkind. This framing traps him. Because good men don't want to be bad men, and manipulation often works best on men with strong morals. Another important point is how silence is used. Not silence as absence, silence as consequence. When behavior is met with withdrawal instead of communication, it teaches. It teaches what to avoid and what to seek. Most men respond by modifying behavior to restore warmth. That modification is conditioning. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men are manipulated not because women are powerful, but because men are emotionally transparent too early. They reveal fears, needs, weak points, and once revealed, those points can be pressed unintentionally, not out of cruelty, out of instinct. Human beings lean where leverage exists. Another pattern is emotional inflation and deflation. Praise followed by criticism, affection followed by distance. This creates emotional highs and lows. Highs bond, lows destabilize, and unstable bonds are easier to control. Another reality men avoid is this: manipulation thrives in men who fear confrontation, who avoid discomfort, who equate harmony with health. Manipulation loves harmony seekers because harmony seekers will sacrifice truth to keep peace. Another deep truth is that manipulation often intensifies when a man starts regaining strength. When he pulls back slightly, sets boundaries, stops overgiving. Suddenly, emotions spike, accusations appear, victimhood emerges, urgency increases. This is not coincidence. This is leverage being threatened, and threatened leverage reacts. Another overlooked aspect is how women test emotional boundaries unconsciously. Not to dominate, but to see what's allowed. If emotional pressure works once, it will be used again. If guilt works, it becomes a tool. If silence works, it becomes a strategy. Not planned, learned. This is why manipulation grows over time, because patterns that work repeat themselves. Another harsh truth is this: men often confuse emotional depth with emotional imbalance. Depth is mutual, imbalance is one-sided. If you are always the one stabilizing, reassuring, or adjusting, the dynamic is already broken. Another mechanism is future ambiguity. Hints of future connection without commitment. Just enough hope to keep investment alive. Hope is powerful, and hope without structure creates dependence. Another point men miss is that manipulation does not require malice. It requires emotional advantage. And emotional advantage comes from being less attached. Whoever cares less controls the pace. This is not cruelty. It's physics. Emotional physics. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men are manipulated because they ignore early discomfort. They feel something is off, but they suppress it to maintain connection. That suppression trains tolerance. Tolerance trains submission. Another layer is identity erosion. Over time, the man stops doing things he enjoys, stops expressing opinions freely, stops acting from his own rhythm. Not because he's forced, but because adjustment becomes habit. And once habit forms, identity fades. This is why men later say they lost themselves. They didn't lose themselves suddenly. They surrendered in increments, and each increment felt small enough to justify. Another hard truth is that manipulation ends when awareness begins, because manipulation cannot survive observation. The moment you stop reacting automatically, the dynamic weakens. When you stop adjusting emotionally, leverage dissolves. When you stop fearing loss, control collapses. This is why understanding these patterns is dangerous, not to women, to manipulation itself. Because once you see the structure, you stop being confused, and confusion is manipulation's favorite environment. Clarity destroys it, and once clarity appears, everything starts changing. Not through force, but through non-participation. That's when the real shift begins. At this point, it becomes clear why so many men feel confused instead of controlled. Because manipulation rarely feels like pressure. It feels like responsibility. Responsibility for her emotions. Responsibility for the mood. Responsibility for keeping things stable. And once a man accepts the emotional responsibility that was never his, control becomes invisible. Another dark psychological pattern is emotional mirroring, used selectively. At first, she mirrors your energy, your values, your interests. This creates rapid connection. The man feels understood, but over time, the mirroring fades. And now he is the one trying to reconnect to that earlier closeness. He starts chasing the version of her that existed at the beginning. This is one of the most powerful manipulation loops, because the man is no longer responding to reality. He is responding to memory. Another subtle mechanism is emotional escalation without resolution. Arguments that circle, conversations that never end, issues that are raised but never truly solved. This keeps the man emotionally engaged and mentally occupied. Resolution would free him, so resolution never fully arrives. Another tactic is selective vulnerability. She opens up deeply at moments when he is pulling away, just enough to re-hook emotional investment. Not consciously planned, but instinctively timed. This creates emotional confusion. He feels needed again, important again, and that feeling overrides logic. Another uncomfortable truth is how manipulation hides inside praise. Compliments that subtly imply obligation. You're the only one who understands me. I don't know what I'd do without you. You're different from other men. At first, this feels validating, but over time it creates pressure, because now leaving feels like betrayal, and staying feels like duty. Another mechanism is emotional triangulation, not necessarily with another man, but with external stress, family problems, work issues, past trauma. The man becomes the emotional anchor. He supports, listens, holds space. But the connection becomes built on emotional labor instead of mutual desire. Once emotional labor replaces attraction, power shifts. Another dark pattern is intermittent reinforcement, unpredictable affection, moments of closeness followed by withdrawal. This pattern is psychologically addictive because the brain becomes focused on regaining the reward. The man waits for the next high, and while waiting, he complies. This is one of the most strongest conditioning tools in human psychology. Another manipulation pathway is emotional reframing. When the man expresses discomfort, it gets reframed as insecurity. When he sets a boundary, it gets reframed as selfishness. When he questions the dynamic, it gets reframed as lack of trust. This reframing trains him to doubt his own perceptions, and self-doubt is leverage. Another layer is delayed accountability. Apologies that come late, explanations that don't quite resolve anything. Just enough acknowledgement to keep him invested, but not enough to change behavior. This creates hope. Hope keeps him inside the loop. Another truth men rarely acknowledge is that manipulation often feeds on empathy. Men with high empathy are easier to manipulate because they prioritize understanding over boundaries. They excuse behavior. They rationalize red flags. They suppress discomfort. Empathy without self-respect becomes self-erasure. Another pattern is emotional debt. She reminds him of past effort, past sacrifices, past moments of closeness. This creates a sense of obligation, as if leaving would invalidate everything that came before. This is not love. This is sunk cost pressure. Another dark mechanism is pace control. She decides when to talk, when to pull back, when to reconnect. The man adapts, and adaptation over time becomes submission. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men are manipulated because they equate intensity with meaning. Strong emotions feel important, but intensity without balance creates dependency. Dependency creates control. Another layer is identity shaping. Subtle comments about who he should be, how he should act, what version of himself is acceptable. At first, it feels like growth. Over time, it feels like constraint. Another tactic is emotional exhaustion through cycles. Fight, make up, bond, repeat. The bond feels deep because it survived conflict, but the conflict was the glue. Without it, there is nothing holding things together. Another hard truth is that manipulation often survives because men are taught to endure, to be patient, to be understanding, to be strong. But endurance without boundaries becomes tolerance, and tolerance becomes permission. Another subtle dynamic is fear of being seen as the villain. Men often stay quiet to avoid being labeled cold, uncaring, or cruel. Manipulation thrives on that fear because silence keeps the dynamic intact. Another reality is that manipulation is reinforced when it works even once. If guilt works, it will be used again. If silence works, it will be repeated. If pressure works, it will escalate. Not consciously, but behavior that gets results repeats. This is human nature. Another uncomfortable truth is this: most men do not leave manipulative dynamics when they should. They leave when they are depleted, and depletion makes recovery harder. This is why awareness matters early, not to accuse, but to recognize patterns. Another important realization is that manipulation loses power when the man stops explaining himself. Explanation invites debate. Debate invites pressure. Pressure invites control. Another layer is how manipulation collapses when emotional reactions stop being predictable. Predictable reactions are easy to steer. Unpredictable emotional stillness is not. This is why the moment a man regains emotional control, the dynamic changes. Not because he confronts, but because he stops feeding it. Another deep truth is that manipulation cannot survive without participation, and participation is almost always emotional. When emotion stops being reactive, manipulation loses oxygen. Another uncomfortable truth is this: you don't break manipulation by winning arguments. You break it by not negotiating your emotional center. The moment your self-worth stops depending on the dynamic, leverage disappears. This is why so many manipulative dynamics end suddenly when a man emotionally detaches. Not dramatically, quietly. The behaviors stop working, the pressure loses effect, and the person manipulating often doesn't even understand why. They just feel that control is gone, and control cannot be demanded back. It only exists when given. This is the turning point. Not when you accuse, not when you explode, but when you see clearly. Because once you see clearly, you stop reacting automatically. And automatic reaction is the engine that drives manipulation. When that engine shuts down, the entire structure begins to collapse. Without confrontation, without chaos, just through awareness and emotional strength. This is where real power begins to return, not by force, but by refusal to participate. When a man finally begins to see these patterns, something interesting happens. The manipulation doesn't suddenly stop, it changes shape. Because when automatic reactions disappear, leverage weakens. And when leverage weakens, pressure increases. This is where many men misread what's happening. They think things are getting worse. In reality, things are being exposed. One of the most common shifts at this stage is emotional escalation. Suddenly, feelings become intense. Conversations become dramatic. Emotions feel urgent. This is not intimacy increasing, this is leverage being tested. When subtle pressure no longer works, stronger emotion appears. Not always intentionally, but instinctively. Another pattern that appears is victim framing. She may begin to feel misunderstood, unheard, unappreciated. And those feelings may be real, but the timing matters. They surface precisely when emotional control starts slipping. Victim framing redirects attention. It pulls the man back into emotional responsibility. If he reacts by rescuing, explaining, or overgiving, the old dynamic returns. If he stays centered, something breaks. Another common shift is moral escalation. Suddenly, boundaries become framed as cruelty. Distance becomes framed as punishment. Self-respect becomes framed as selfishness. This is one of the most powerful manipulation tools. Because good men fear being bad men, and manipulation often survives on that fear. The man feels pressure to prove his goodness, to show care, to reassure, and reassurance recreates leverage. Another layer is emotional urgency. Everything feels like it must be resolved now. Conversations cannot wait. Feelings cannot be paused. Space becomes unacceptable. Urgency collapses reflection. Reflection threatens control. The man who gives in to urgency loses position. The man who slows things down regains it. Another subtle shift is rewriting history. Past events are reframed. Previous agreements are blurred. Intentions are questioned. This creates doubt. Doubt destabilizes self-trust. Self-trust's loss recreates dependence. Another pattern is selective accountability. Apologies that focus on emotion but not behavior. Acknowledgement without change. This keeps hope alive. Hope keeps the man engaged. Another escalation is boundary testing. Small violations, dismissive comments, subtle disrespect. Not overt, just enough to see what's tolerated. Tolerance is read as permission. Another uncomfortable truth is that manipulation often intensifies right before it collapses, because the system senses loss of control. This is why many men leave at the peak of emotional chaos, not because chaos appeared randomly, but because it was the last attempt to regain leverage. Another shift is emotional bargaining. If you cared, you would. If you loved me, you'd. If this mattered, you'd. Love becomes conditional. Care becomes transactional, and transaction replaces connection. Another layer is emotional exhaustion tactics. Long conversations that go nowhere, repeated emotional loops, circular arguments. Exhaustion weakens boundaries. Weak boundaries restore control. Another thing men misinterpret is increased affection, sudden warmth, sudden closeness, sudden softness. This can be genuine, or it can be intermittent reinforcement returning. Affection becomes a reward again. Reward reinstates conditioning. Another important truth is this: not all manipulation is malicious. Much of it is self-protective behavior. Fear of abandonment, fear of losing control, fear of vulnerability. Understanding this does not mean tolerating it. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. Another layer is how manipulation collapses when consequences appear. Not punishments, consequences. Distance, reduced access, reduced emotional labor. Quiet, consistent consequences change behavior faster than confrontation ever could. Another uncomfortable truth is that manipulation thrives on conversation, not clarity. Talking endlessly keeps emotion alive. Clarity ends negotiation. Clarity removes leverage. This is why the man who becomes clear without hostility becomes dangerous to manipulation, because clarity does not argue, it simply stands. Another key shift happens internally for the man. He stops trying to be understood and starts prioritizing being aligned. Alignment removes the need for validation. Validation seeking fuels manipulation. Another pattern that appears is emotional accusation. You've changed. You're not the same. You're cold now. Change here means loss of access, and loss of access feels threatening to control. The man who does not defend against these accusations regains power. Defense implies guilt. Silence implies certainty. Another truth men rarely accept is this. You don't dismantle manipulation by confronting the manipulator. You dismantle it by withdrawing emotional participation. Participation is the currency. Without currency, the system collapses. Another subtle shift is emotional testing through conflict. Arguments are used to provoke reaction. Reaction restores leverage. Non-reaction dissolves it. Another layer is how manipulation fails when a man stops explaining his boundaries. Explanation invites debate. Debate invites pressure. Action communicates finality. Another uncomfortable truth is that some dynamics only end when the man becomes willing to lose the relationship. Not because he wants to, but because fear of loss is the final leverage. Once fear dissolves, manipulation has no grip. Another key point is this. When manipulation begins to fail, respect often appears. Not always love, not always harmony, but respect. And respect changes everything. Another realization men have at this stage is how much energy manipulation consumed, how much attention it demanded, how much identity it eroded. This realization is painful, but freeing, because awareness replaces confusion, and confusion is manipulation's natural habitat. Once clarity arrives, the emotional fog lifts, and when fog lifts, decisions become easier. Not emotional decisions, clear ones. This is why manipulation rarely survives long once a man becomes emotionally self-directed, because self-direction removes dependency, and dependency is the root of all leverage. This is where the dynamic begins to collapse fully, not through conflict, but through non-cooperation, not through anger, but through emotional sovereignty. This is the stage where the man is no longer inside the manipulation, even if the relationship still exists, because the structure that sustained it is gone. And without structure, manipulation cannot stand. It simply falls apart, quietly, inevitably, without trauma. This is the moment where the man stops asking what she's doing to him and starts seeing what he is no longer doing for the dynamic. And that shift changes everything. At the end of all of this, one truth becomes unavoidable. Manipulation only survives where emotional dependence exists. Not dependence of love, not dependence on connection, dependence on outcomes. The moment your peace depends on how someone treats you, you hand them leverage. And leverage does not need cruelty to function. It only needs access. This is why so many men feel controlled without ever being commanded. They were never forced. They adjusted themselves again and again until adjustment became identity. The most important realization you can have is this. Women do not manipulate men who are emotionally sovereign, not because they are afraid, but because there is nothing to work with. No fear to activate, no guilt to apply, no urgency to exploit, no need to threaten. Manipulation requires hooks, and the strongest hook is fear of loss. When that fear dissolves, control evaporates. This is why the real solution is not confrontation. Confrontation keeps the game alive. The solution is withdrawal of emotional leverage. You stop explaining, you stop justifying, you stop negotiating your boundaries. You become clear, and clarity is manipulation's enemy. Another truth most men never hear is that many women are not aware they are manipulating. They are responding to dynamics. Dynamics reward behavior. Behavior repeats. Once the reward disappears, the behavior changes, or the connection ends. Either way, manipulation loses. This is why awareness is so dangerous to manipulation, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unknow it. You notice when guilt appears. You notice when silence becomes pressure. You notice when affection becomes conditional. And noticing changes how you respond. You no longer react. You choose. Choice replaces reaction. And reaction is the engine manipulation runs on. Another uncomfortable truth is that manipulation does not end with better communication. It ends with better self-regulation. When you regulate yourself emotionally, no one else has to. And when no one else regulates you, no one controls you. This is why men who reclaim emotional independence often feel like everything changes at once. Not because others changed, but because the dynamic did. The same behavior no longer works. The same pressure no longer moves you. And when you stop moving, the whole structure collapses. Quietly. This is also why manipulation feels invisible until it stops. When it stops, clarity arrives, and with clarity comes self-respect. Self-respect restores boundaries. Boundaries restore balance. Balance restores power. Not power over someone else, power over yourself. That is the only power that matters. Once you reach this point, relationships become very simple. Not easy, but simple. You no longer guess. You no longer overthink. You no longer feel confused. You see behavior clearly, and you respond accordingly. This is where manipulation loses its mystique. It becomes predictable, and predictable things lose power. Now, if this video helped you see how emotional leverage forms and how manipulation operates beneath awareness, there is one video you should watch next. In this video, we focused on how control happens without men realizing it, but there is another layer that explains why this control works so effectively and what emotional dynamic women are most vulnerable to themselves. That's exactly what I break down in my video called The Hidden Female Weakness That No Woman Admits. That video explains the emotional vulnerability that keeps women engaged, why unresolved tension affects them deeply, and how emotional self-control changes everything. Watch that next. Because once you understand both sides of the dynamic, manipulation stops being something that happens to you. It becomes something you see clearly. And what you can see clearly can no longer control you. That is where real freedom